I don't shake hands with people I don't take seriously." The words landed before the silence did, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the polished stillness of the 42nd floor boardroom like a glass edge dragged across marble, and for a brief second no one moved, no one breathed, as if the entire room had to catch up with what had just happened. Marcus Hale stood there, hands still extended in midair, fingers relaxed, not stiff, not demanding, just offered. A simple professional gesture suspended beneath the soft white glow of recessed ceiling lights that reflected off the long conference table and the wall of windows stretching out toward the Manhattan skyline, where late afternoon sun bounced off steel towers and poured into the room like liquid gold, illuminating everything except the expression on Victoria Langford's face, which remained cool, composed, untouched by the warmth flooding in from outside. She didn't look at his hand. Not directly. Her gaze passed over it the way one might glance at something misplaced on a desk, something irrelevant, something that didn't belong. And then, almost casually, she reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer, pulled out a folded white handkerchief, and wiped her palm with slow, precise movements, as if erasing the possibility of contact before it ever happened. A few of the executives shifted in their seats, leather creaking softly beneath them, eyes flickering between Marcus and Victoria, unsure whether to look away or pretend nothing unusual had occurred. But no one spoke, because no one in that room ever spoke before Victoria Langford did. And right now, she had already said enough. Marcus didn't pull his hand back immediately. He let the moment settle, let the silence breathe, his arms steady, his posture unchanged, shoulders squared but not tense, his expression unreadable except for the faintest narrowing of his eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, something deeper, like a calculation unfolding behind a calm exterior. He had walked into rooms like this before, rooms where the air smelled faintly of polished wood and ambition, where decisions worth hundreds of millions were made. Between sips of coffee and carefully chosen words, rooms where people measured each other in seconds and decided who mattered and who didn't before introductions were even finished. His suit was simple, charcoal gray, tailored but not flashy, the kind of suit that didn't announce wealth but didn't apologize for presence either. And yet in this room, under this light, beside this table filled with people who wore power like a second skin, he knew exactly how he was being seen, not as a partner, not as an equal, but as a question mark that Victoria Langford had already decided to erase. Finally, he lowered his hand, not quickly, not with hesitation, just a smooth, deliberate motion, as if the gesture had never been rejected, only completed in his own time, and he placed it lightly against the leather folder he carried, fingertips resting on the edge, grounding himself in something tangible while the room waited for what would come next. Victoria folded the handkerchief once, twice, precise corners aligning, and slipped it back into her pocket without a word, then lifted her gaze to meet his for the first time, her eyes sharp, assessing, the kind of look that didn't just observe but judged, categorized, dismissed, all in a single glance. "Let's not waste time," she said, her voice even, controlled, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, to setting the pace, to deciding when something began and when it ended. And around the table, heads nodded almost imperceptibly, pens lifted, screens flickered to life, as if the meeting had officially started only now that she had allowed it to. But Marcus didn't sit. Not yet. He remained standing at the edge of the table, the city stretching behind him, sunlight outlining his silhouette in a quiet halo that contrasted sharply with the cool, shadowed stillness inside the room. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted, too subtle to name, too brief to catch, like the faint tremor before a fault line moves. And though no one could have said it out loud, the air felt different, heavier, as if the moment that had just passed was not over, only waiting. Marcus Hale finally took his seat, but not in a hurry, not with the subtle scramble of someone trying to recover from a slight, but with the same measured control he had carried when he first walked into the room, his chair sliding back with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the lingering quiet. And as he settled in, he placed the leather folder in front of him, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, fingertips brushing once across its surface as if confirming something only he could feel. He did not look at Victoria Langford again immediately. Instead, His gaze moved across the room, calm, observant, taking in the details others ignored. The way one executive tapped his pen twice before every note. The way another avoided eye contact altogether, shoulders slightly hunched as if shrinking from tension that had not been spoken aloud. The faint hum of the air conditioning vent above, steady and indifferent. The city beyond the glass continuing its rhythm without pause. Yellow cabs threading through traffic far below, like veins carrying urgency through a restless body. "You asked for 10 minutes, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the room with precise authority, not raised, not harsh, but final in a way that left no space for negotiation, her fingers resting lightly on the table, nails immaculate, posture perfect. Every inch of her composed in a way that suggested control was not something she maintained, but something she embodied. Marcus nodded once, a small motion, almost respectful, but not submissive. "I will only need 7, he replied, his voice steady, low, carrying just enough weight to reach every corner of the room without forcing itself there. And for a moment, something flickered in the eyes of the man seated closest to him, a brief glance of curiosity, quickly buried beneath practiced neutrality. Marcus opened the folder, the soft crease of leather parting as he revealed a set of documents inside. Crisp, organized, each page marked with subtle tabs that caught the light when he shifted them. And he did not rush, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, allowing the simple act of preparation to draw attention back to him, to shift the center of the room ever so slightly. Langford Tech has lost 12% of its market value in the last 90 days. He began, not accusatory, not sympathetic, just factual. The numbers landing with a quiet weight that no one interrupted, because everyone in that room already knew them, but hearing them spoken aloud changed something, made them less abstract, more real, more immediate. Victoria did not react, at least not outwardly, but her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly, the slightest tightening at the corner that only someone watching closely would notice. Marcus continued, his tone unchanged. Your overseas expansion stalled in Q2. Your liquidity buffer has narrowed to just under 4 months at your current burn rate. And your primary competitor announced a strategic partnership last week that you were not included in. A pause followed, not for effect, but because the truth itself required space. And in that pause, the room seemed to lean forward without moving, drawn into the gravity of what was being laid out. Marcus lifted one of the documents, sliding it across the table with a smooth, controlled motion until it stopped just within Victoria's reach, not pushed aggressively, not presented humbly, simply placed where it needed to be. I am offering a bridge investment, he said, one that stabilizes your position, buys you 12 to 18 months, and gives you leverage to renegotiate your next round on your terms instead of theirs. He did not smile. He did not soften the edges of what he was saying. He simply let it exist, clear and undeniable. Across the table, one of the executives shifted again, this time leaning slightly forward, eyes flicking to the document, then to Victoria, waiting, always waiting for her reaction before forming his own. Victoria did not reach for the paper. Not yet. Her gaze remained on Marcus, steady, unblinking, as if she were trying to measure something beyond the numbers, something about him that did not align with the version of him she had already decided on just minutes earlier. And why? She said slowly, each word placed with precision. Would you be interested in doing that? The question hung in the air, layered with more than curiosity, carrying a trace of skepticism, a hint of dismissal, the unspoken assumption that there had to be a catch, that nothing offered by someone like him could exist without one. Marcus met her gaze now, directly, without hesitation, without challenge, simply present. Because, he said, I recognize value when I see it. The words were simple, but they landed differently this time, not as a defense, not as a pitch, but as a statement that carried its own quiet certainty. And for a brief second, the room shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and though no one spoke, the weight of what had just been set in motion pressed gently against the silence, waiting for something to break it. Victoria Langford finally reached for the document, but not with urgency, not with the quiet relief that might follow a solution appearing at the edge of a problem, but with a controlled, almost reluctant motion, as if the paper itself had to earn the right to be touched, her fingers sliding it closer inch by inch across the polished surface until it rested directly in front of her, aligned with the center of her view. And for a moment she did not open it. She only looked at it, eyes scanning the top line without fully committing, as though even engaging with the offer carried a cost she was not yet willing to pay. Around the table, the others followed her lead without realizing it, their attention tethered to her movements, to the rhythm she set, the invisible permission she granted with each small decision. And in that quiet synchronization, the hierarchy of the room became unmistakable, not declared, not enforced, simply understood. Marcus Hale remained still, hands resting lightly on the table, posture relaxed but deliberate, his presence grounded in something that did not shift with the tension in the air, and he did not rush her, did not fill the silence with explanation or persuasion, allowing her to arrive at the next step on her own terms, because he understood something that many in that room did not. That pressure applied too early often breaks the wrong thing. Victoria opened the document at last, the soft turn of paper barely audible, and her eyes moved quickly now, scanning figures, clauses, projections, the language of control and risk laid out in clean, structured lines, and for a brief second, something in her expression shifted, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to register, a subtle recalibration, a flicker of recognition that what she was looking at was not improvised, not opportunistic, but precise, intentional, built with an understanding that mirrored her own. She turned a page, then another, faster now, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, and as she read, the room held its breath in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of silence that settles when something important is being measured, weighed, decided without words. One of the executives leaned slightly forward again, his pen hovering above his notepad, not writing, just waiting, while another adjusted her glasses, eyes darting between Victoria and the figures on her tablet, cross-checking, confirming, trying to see what Victoria saw before she said anything. "This assumes access to your private capital network," Victoria said finally, her voice breaking the silence with a controlled edge, not questioning, but testing, each word placed carefully as if it were part of a larger calculation. Marcus nodded once. "It does," he replied, just as steady as before. Victoria's eyes lifted from the page to meet his again, sharper now, more focused, as if the version of him she had initially dismissed no longer aligned with the data in front of her, and that mismatch unsettled something beneath her composed exterior. "You are asking for significant influence," she continued, her tone tightening slightly, not defensive, but alert, aware of the implications buried in the numbers. "I am offering alignment," Marcus said, and the distinction hung in the air, subtle but meaningful, the kind of difference that only mattered if you understood what it meant. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, the leather responding with a soft, controlled sound, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document as she studied him again, longer this time, not just evaluating the proposal, but re-evaluating him, recalibrating the space he occupied in her mind. And for the first time since he had entered the room, there was the faintest hesitation in her gaze, not doubt, not uncertainty, but a pause, the kind that appears when something does not fit the narrative you have already decided to believe. "We have other options," she said, and the statement carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was final in tone, the kind of line drawn not just for him, but for everyone watching, a reminder of where control still resided. Marcus did not react immediately. He let the words settle, let them exist without challenge, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, and then he gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment, as if he had expected nothing less. "Of course you do," he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, but there was something beneath it now, something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He closed the folder slowly, the soft press of leather sealing the documents inside, and the sound, though gentle, felt definitive, like the closing of something more than just paper, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to shift again, the balance tilting in a way no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel, subtle, almost invisible, like the air just before a storm changes direction without warning. No one spoke immediately after Marcus closed the folder, and the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt occupied, dense with everything that had not been said and everything that had just shifted beneath the surface. And for a brief moment, even the city beyond the glass seemed distant, muted, as if the room had sealed itself off from the outside world. Victoria Langford remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze still fixed on Marcus, but there was a difference now, subtle yet unmistakable, a recalibration that she had not yet acknowledged out loud, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document she had just reviewed, as though letting go of it too quickly might mean losing control of the situation she was still trying to define. "If that is everything," she said. Finally, her voice steady, but carrying a colder edge now, one that signaled a decision rather than a discussion, "Then we are done here." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of authority, and around the table, there was a quiet shift, chairs adjusting slightly, a few hands moving toward laptops, the subtle choreography of a meeting preparing to end, because when Victoria ended something, it ended. Marcus did not move right away. He did not gather his things in haste, did not rush to exit as if dismissed. Instead, he placed one hand on the closed folder, fingers resting there for a brief second longer than necessary, as if marking the moment in a way no one else could see. "Understood," he said, his tone even, respectful, but not diminished, and then he stood, the motion smooth, controlled, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that echoed faintly against the glass walls. As he turned slightly, one of the executives across the table hesitated, opening his mouth as if to say something, then stopping himself, his eyes flicking quickly toward Victoria before dropping back down, the instinct to defer stronger than the impulse to speak. Marcus noticed, but he did not react. He simply reached for his folder, lifting it with the same deliberate calm he had carried since the beginning. Victoria watched him now without interruption, her expression composed, but her eyes sharper, tracking him in a way she had not allowed herself to do before, as if trying to understand how the dynamic in the room had shifted without her permission. "Mr. Hale," she said, just before he turned fully away, her voice cutting through the quiet once more, not louder, but precise enough to stop movement without effort. Marcus paused, not immediately, but after a fraction of a second, enough to show that he chose to stop, not that he was commanded to. He turned back slightly, just enough to face her, his posture open, but not yielding. "Yes," he replied. Victoria held his gaze, the room waiting again, suspended in that same quiet tension that had defined the meeting from the start. "We evaluate opportunities based on fit," she said, each word measured, deliberate, a statement, crafted as much for the room as for him. "And this does not align with our direction." It was not just a rejection, it was a framing, a way to reassert control, to define the narrative before it could define her, and a few heads around the table nodded almost imperceptibly, absorbing the conclusion she had just established. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when she finished, he gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment of her position. "Of course," he said quietly, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, though the weight of it lingered longer than the words themselves, "Alignment is important." For a brief second, something in Victoria's expression tightened, not visibly to most, but enough to register in the stillness between them, as if the echo of her own words had returned with a different meaning attached. Marcus turned then, this time without pause, and walked toward the glass doors at the far end of the room, his footsteps steady, measured, each one landing with quiet certainty against the polished floor, and as he reached the handle, the reflection of the room stretched across the glass in front of him, the long table, the seated figures, Victoria at the center, all contained within a surface that separated them from the city beyond. He pushed the door open, and a faint shift in air followed, cooler, lighter, the subtle difference between inside and outside space brushing past him as he stepped through. Behind him, the door closed with a soft, controlled click, and for a moment, no one moved. Victoria remained seated, her eyes still fixed on the space he had just occupied, the absence now more noticeable than his presence had been, and though she did not say it, did not show it, something had unsettled the certainty she had carried into the room, something small, quiet, but persistent, like a question that had not been asked yet refused to disappear. The door had barely settled back into its frame when the room exhaled, not audibly, but in the subtle release of posture, in the way shoulders dropped by half an inch and pins finally touched paper again, as if the presence that had just left had been holding something in place that no one could quite define. Victoria Langford did not move at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the glass door, on the faint reflection of her own silhouette staring back at her from the other side. And for a brief moment, the reflection felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone who had just made a decision that had not yet fully revealed its consequences. "Let us proceed," she said, her voice steady, reclaiming control of the room with practiced ease. And instantly the quiet resumed its structured rhythm. Laptops opened, screens glowed, and the meeting shifted back into motion. But something underneath it all had changed, something subtle, like a misalignment no one could see but everyone could feel. Numbers were discussed, projections reviewed, timelines adjusted, yet every few minutes, a glance drifted toward the empty chair Marcus had occupied, toward the space where the conversation had not ended so much as been cut off. Victoria spoke, directed, corrected, but her focus fractured in small, nearly invisible ways, a fraction of a second too long before responding. A brief pause where certainty used to be immediate, and though no one would have named it, the precision that defined her leadership had been touched by something quieter, something unresolved. 30 minutes later, the meeting concluded, not abruptly, but with a controlled finality, chairs sliding back, documents gathered, voices lowering as executives filtered out in measured silence, each one carrying with them an awareness that something important had happened, even if they could not articulate what. Victoria remained seated after the last person left, the room now larger in its emptiness, the late afternoon light shifting toward evening, casting longer shadows across the table, and for the first time since the meeting began, she allowed her gaze to drop fully to the document Marcus had left behind. It was still there, perfectly aligned, untouched since she had set it down, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached for it again, fingers brushing the edge before pulling it closer. The paper felt the same, the numbers unchanged, yet the context had shifted, and as her eyes moved across the lines once more, the clarity of the proposal pressed against the decision she had already made, not challenging it directly, but existing beside it in a way that refused to be ignored. She turned another page, slower this time, reading not just for structure, but for intention, tracing the logic behind each clause, each projection, each carefully placed safeguard, and with every line, a quiet realization began to form, not loud, not immediate, but persistent, like a thought that does not leave once it has arrived. Her phone buzzed softly against the table, the vibration subtle but distinct in the quiet room, and she glanced down, expecting routine updates, minor notifications, nothing that required urgency, but the screen told a different story. A message from her chief financial officer appeared first, brief, direct, "We need to talk now." Before she could respond, another alert followed, this one from Market Analytics, the subject line flashing in bold, "Competitor Announcement," and beneath it, a preview of the headline that made her hand still for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. She opened it, her eyes scanning quickly, the words arranging themselves into something undeniable, something that shifted the ground beneath her in a way she could not immediately control. A strategic partnership had been finalized overnight, capital secured, expansion accelerated, and the name attached to the funding, the name that appeared twice in the article, once in the headline and once in the closing paragraph, was one she recognized without hesitation. Marcus Hale. Victoria leaned back slowly, the chair responding with a soft creak, her gaze lifting from the screen to the empty room around her. And for the first time since the handshake that never happened, the silence felt different, no longer controlled, no longer neutral, but heavy with consequence, the kind of silence that does not wait for permission before revealing what comes next. Victoria did not move for several seconds after reading the headline, her phone still resting in her hand, screen glowing softly against her palm as the last light of the day stretched across the conference table and climbed slowly up the glass walls behind her, turning the skyline outside into a reflection of gold and shadow that felt distant, almost unreal compared to the sharp clarity of the words she had just seen. Marcus Hale. The name sat heavier now than it had an hour ago, no longer just a visitor, no longer just an option dismissed in a controlled room, but something else entirely, something that had already moved forward while she had chosen to stand still. She placed the phone down carefully, not abruptly, not with frustration, but with a precision that suggested she was holding something back, something that did not belong in the open, and her fingers lingered on the edge of the device for a moment before she pulled her hand away. The silence in the room deepened, no longer neutral, no longer procedural, but reflective, pressing inward instead of outward. And for the first time that day, Victoria allowed herself to lean back fully in her chair, her posture no longer commanding, but contained, as if the space around her had shifted in ways she could not immediately correct. Outside, traffic moved in steady lines, headlights beginning to flicker on as evening approached, each car carrying on with its own direction, its own purpose, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening 42 floors above. Victoria's gaze drifted to the window, not focusing on anything specific, just watching the movement, the rhythm, the flow of a world that did not pause for hesitation. And in that reflection, she saw her own outline faintly layered over the city, a figure still, composed, but now carrying a question she had not needed to ask before. Her hand moved slowly across the table, resting once more on the document Marcus had left behind, the edges still perfectly aligned, the structure still intact, unchanged by the decision she had made, and yet everything about it felt different now, as if the meaning of the pages had shifted without the ink moving at all. She opened it again, not quickly, not searching for something specific, but reading with a different kind of attention, one that traced intention instead of just information, one that followed the logic beneath the numbers. And as she turned each page, the quiet precision of the proposal revealed itself more clearly, not aggressive, not desperate, but deliberate, designed with foresight, with awareness, with an understanding of timing that now felt uncomfortably exact. Her phone buzzed again, this time with multiple notifications arriving in rapid succession, each vibration stacking on top of the last, and she glanced down briefly, the screen filling with updates from internal channels, analysts, board members, all asking the same unspoken question in different forms. The competitor's stock had already begun to rise, market confidence shifting, investor sentiment changing direction. She did not open the messages immediately. Instead, she let the phone sit there, vibrating softly, the sound blending into the quiet hum of the room, a reminder that the world outside was already responding while she remained still. Victoria exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, but heavier than before, and she reached for the handkerchief in her blazer pocket, unfolding it with the same precise movements as earlier, her eyes lowering to the fabric for a brief moment, as if seeing it differently now, not as a gesture of control, but as a reminder of one. She held it there, just for a second, then folded it again and set it down on the table instead of putting it away, leaving it visible, small, simple, but impossible to ignore in the quiet space between her and the document. Her gaze returned to the pages, but her focus had shifted beyond them, beyond the numbers, beyond the structure, settling instead on the space between what had been offered and what had been refused, and for the first time, the distance between those 2 points felt larger than she had anticipated, not just in business terms, but in something deeper, something that could not be corrected with a simple adjustment or a revised projection. The room remained silent. The city continued its motion, and Victoria sat there, still, composed, but no longer untouched, the weight of the moment settling into something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, something that would not disappear when the lights dimmed or the meeting notes were filed away, something that would wait, quietly, until she decided what came next. The city lights had fully taken over by the time Victoria Langford stood from her chair, the glass walls now reflecting a darker version of the skyline, each window across the buildings outside glowing like distant signals in a system that had already begun shifting without her. And as she gathered the document Marcus Hale had left behind, her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if every action now carried a weight that had not been there before. She walked out of the conference room without calling for assistance, without her usual pace, the soft click of her heels echoing faintly along the corridor as the evening staff moved quietly around her, their voices low, their presence almost invisible, yet she noticed them in a way she had not earlier, small details registering at the edge of her awareness. The way a junior analyst paused mid-step to let her pass. The way a receptionist lowered her voice instinctively, the subtle adjustments people made in response to her presence, habits she had long taken for granted. Inside her office, the lighting was softer, warmer than the conference room, the kind of light designed to ease tension. But tonight it only seemed to highlight the contrast between control and uncertainty, and she set the document down on her desk beside her phone, which had continued to fill with messages, alerts, requests for immediate decisions, all circling the same development that had already begun reshaping the market. She sat, but not immediately, her hand resting briefly on the back of the chair as she looked out over the city again, her reflection faintly overlapping the view, and for a moment, she allowed the silence to settle without interruption, without the constant movement that usually defined her decisions. Then she reached for her phone and opened the internal report her chief financial officer had sent, the detailed breakdown unfolding line by line, confirming what the headlines had already suggested, but with more precision, more clarity, and less room for interpretation. The competitor's valuation had surged within hours. Investor confidence had shifted almost immediately. And at the center of it, the capital structure, the timing, the terms, all bore the unmistakable pattern of someone who did not just understand the market, but anticipated it, someone who moved before others realized movement was necessary. Marcus Hale. The name appeared again, this time in the report itself, tied not just to the funding, but to previous deals, past restructurings, quiet interventions that had stabilized companies without drawing attention. And as Victoria scrolled further, a realization began to take shape, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, unavoidable. 3 years ago, during a critical downturn, Langford Tech had secured a short-term liquidity injection through a third-party intermediary, a deal structured quickly, efficiently, without public attribution, something she had accepted at the time as a fortunate alignment of opportunity. She had never followed the origin beyond the surface. Now, the deeper layers were being revealed in the data in front of her, connections drawn, timelines aligned, and the source of that intervention, the quiet hand behind the stabilization that had allowed her company to recover, was no longer hidden. Marcus Hale. Victoria's hand stilled on the screen, her breathing slowing as the full implication settled, not as a shock, but as a shift in understanding, a redefinition of a moment she had thought she fully controlled. She leaned back into her chair, the leather soft beneath her, her gaze lifting from the phone to the reflection in the window, and for the first time, the image looking back at her did not feel entirely certain, not fractured, not weak, but changed, carrying the weight of a recognition that could not be undone. She reached for the handkerchief again, the same one she had used earlier, now resting on her desk, and unfolded it slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the fabric, the gesture no longer automatic, no longer symbolic of control, but of something else, something quieter, something closer to reflection than reaction. The room remained still, the city continued its movement beyond the glass, and in that quiet intersection between what had been and what had just been revealed, Victoria Langford sat with the realization that the man she had dismissed without hesitation had not only understood her company better than she had assumed, but had once chosen to support it without recognition, without acknowledgment, and now, without hesitation, had chosen to move forward without her. The decision did not happen all at once. It did not arrive with urgency or panic, but with a quiet clarity that settled into Victoria Langford's posture as she stood from her desk and reached for her coat, her movements measured, deliberate, as if each step forward required her to acknowledge something she had never needed to confront before. The office lights dimmed automatically as she walked toward the door, the soft shift in brightness trailing behind her like a silent witness, and the hallway beyond was nearly empty now, the late hours stretching the space into something quieter, less controlled, where the usual rhythm of authority felt distant, almost irrelevant. She did not call her assistant. She did not schedule a formal meeting. Instead, she pulled out her phone as she walked, her thumb hovering for a brief second over the contact she had not expected to use again so soon. And then she pressed it, lifting the phone to her ear as the call connected, each ring carrying a weight that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with what had already passed between them. It rang once, twice, then silence, not the silence of disconnection, but the silence of someone answering without speaking. Victoria inhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than usual, and for a moment, she did not say anything, as if the words she had always used so easily now required something more than confidence. "Mr. Hale," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter, stripped of the edge that had defined it earlier that day. "This is Victoria Langford." A pause followed, brief but unmistakable, and when Marcus spoke, his voice carried the same calm, the same grounded stillness it had held in the boardroom, unchanged by the shift in circumstance. "I know," he replied. Simple, direct, without hesitation. The two words landed gently, but they held more than acknowledgment. They carried awareness, timing, and something else, something that made it clear that this moment had been anticipated long before the call was placed. Victoria closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not in frustration, but in recognition, and when she opened them again, she continued, choosing her words carefully, not as a performance, but as a recalibration. "I would like to request a meeting," she said, the sentence structured with precision, but beneath it, there was something new, something that did not rely on authority to carry its weight. Another pause, longer this time, and the quiet on the line felt different from the silence in the boardroom, not tense, not expectant, but measured, as if the space between words was part of the conversation itself. "You already had one," Marcus said, his tone unchanged, not dismissive, not sharp, simply factual, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. Victoria's grip on the phone tightened slightly, her fingers adjusting against the smooth surface as she leaned back lightly against the wall beside her office, the cool glass pressing against her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "Then I am asking for another," she replied, her voice steady. But this time there was no attempt to frame the request, no effort to control how it was received, only the statement itself, clear and direct. The hallway remained still around her, the faint hum of the building systems filling the space where conversation paused, and in that quiet, the difference between who she had been earlier that day and who she was now became impossible to ignore. Marcus did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice remained calm, but there was a weight to it now, something deeper than before. "Why?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a question that required more than strategy to answer. Victoria's gaze drifted to the window at the end of the hallway, the city lights reflecting back at her, countless points of motion and decision unfolding simultaneously, none of them waiting. She exhaled slowly, the breath measured, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different kind of clarity, one that did not rely on position or power. "Because I did not recognize what I was looking at," she said, the words simple, but the meaning behind them deeper than any negotiation, and I should have. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, holding the weight of everything that had shifted between them, everything that could not be undone but could still be acknowledged. On the other end of the line, Marcus remained quiet for a moment longer, and when he finally spoke, there was no rush in his voice, no urgency, only the same steady presence that had defined him from the beginning. "Tomorrow," he said, 9 a.m. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, not in victory, but in acceptance of what the moment required, and when she opened them again, her posture straightened, not in control, but in readiness. "I will be there," she replied, and as the call ended, the hallway returned to silence. But this time it felt different, not like something waiting, but like something that had already begun. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the city already in motion long before the clock reached 9, sunlight filtering between glass towers and casting long reflections across the streets below, and inside a quieter, more understated building several blocks away from Langford Tech's headquarters, the atmosphere felt different, less performative, less driven by the need to impress, and more grounded in something quieter, something deliberate. Victoria Langford stepped through the entrance alone, her pace measured, her posture composed but not rigid, the echo of her heels softer here against polished stone, and as she approached the reception desk, she did not announce herself with authority. She simply gave her name, her voice steady, her tone even, and the receptionist nodded once before gesturing toward a private elevator that opened without delay. The ride up was silent, the soft hum of movement filling the enclosed space as the numbers climbed one by one, and Victoria watched them without distraction, her reflection faintly visible in the brushed steel walls, her expression calm but no longer untouched, carrying the weight of the previous day in a way that did not show outward strain, only quiet awareness. When the doors opened, the space beyond was minimal, clean lines, natural light, no excess, and at the far end of the room, Marcus Hale stood near a wide window overlooking the river, his back partially turned, hands resting loosely at his sides, his presence still, grounded, as if he had been there long before she arrived and would remain long after. He did not turn immediately. He did not rush to greet her. Instead, he allowed her to enter the space fully, to take in the room, the distance, the quiet, and only then did he shift, turning slightly to face her, his expression composed, his gaze steady, the same calm certainty that had defined him from the beginning now more visible in the absence of distraction. Victoria stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant, simply present, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but intentional, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this point. Marcus glanced once at her hands, a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, and Victoria noticed it, not because it was obvious, but because she was paying attention now in a way she had not before, and without hesitation, without performance, she extended her hand, not as a gesture of control, not as a correction, but as a simple acknowledgment, her movement steady, her posture unchanged. Marcus looked at her hand for a brief second, not dismissing it, not rushing to accept it, simply observing, and then his gaze lifted back to her eyes, holding there, measuring something beyond the gesture itself, something that did not rely on words. The moment stretched, quiet, deliberate, and then he reached forward, not quickly, not reluctantly, but with the same calm precision that defined everything he did, and their hands met, firm, steady, without excess, the contact simple, grounded, and in that brief connection, something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone outside the room, but enough to mark the difference between what had been and what was now. They released without hesitation, the gesture complete, and Marcus stepped slightly aside, gesturing toward the table behind him, not with authority, but with invitation, a subtle shift in dynamic that did not need to be explained. Victoria moved forward, taking her seat without urgency, her posture composed, her gaze steady, and as she placed her hands on the table, she set the folded handkerchief down beside her, not hidden, not emphasized, simply present, a quiet acknowledgment of a moment that had already passed. Marcus took his seat across from her, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by clarity, and for a moment, neither reached for documents, neither rushed into numbers or terms, allowing the stillness to exist without interruption. Outside, the river moved steadily, light reflecting across its surface in shifting patterns, and inside, the room held a different kind of movement, quieter, more deliberate, something that did not need urgency to carry weight. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive, and Victoria met his gaze without hesitation, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as an equal presence in a space that no longer required pretense. No words were needed immediately. The conversation had already begun the moment she chose to walk through the door, the moment he chose to let her stay, and in the quiet that followed, the absence of tension spoke louder than any agreement, the kind of silence that does not demand resolution, only recognition. And as the morning light continued to shift across the room, the city moving beyond the glass without pause, what remained between them was not the echo of what had been refused, but the presence of something else. Entirely, something steadier, something earned, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood.